Hello and welcome back to Franklin Covey's twice weekly leadership podcast on Leadership with Scott Miller. I'm your host each week, now in our 6th year, 300 plus episodes of interviewing people that we think have some insight into how to make you a better leader. Maybe a leader of people inside your organization, perhaps you're a leader as an entrepreneur, a leader in your family, or an informal leader in many different roles in your life. Franklin Covey, of course, being the world's most trusted leadership development firm, we take quite delight into turning our pretty bright spotlight, that is this podcast, onto not just thought leaders inside of our organization, but to people that we think have shared values and have different points of view around their areas of expertise. About a year ago, I had the privilege of interviewing today's guest. I have invited him back. You know him as the author of the phenomenal book, The Psychology of Money. His name is Morgan Housel, and he's written a new book called Same as Ever, a guide to what never changes. Morgan, welcome back to On Leadership.
So good to see you, Scott. Thank you for having me back. I always have such wall envy, my book wall relative to yours. I have this silly little bookshelf behind me relative to yours. It's always so great to see.
Yeah, but the difference is you probably wrote all those books. These are just ones that I've read. Now listen, let's talk about you as an author. You wrote this truly seminal book, The Psychology of Money, that has just been a runaway bestseller book. We had you on about a year ago, and you've come back on your newest book, Same as Ever. Would you rewind a little bit? Will you talk a little bit about your professional trajectory that came to writing Psychology of Money? Maybe remind our guests, or our listeners and viewers around a key insight or two from The Psychology of Money.
Yes, thanks, Scott. So I've always been a financial writer since college. Actually, it was never the plan. It was never my intention. But I just kind of stumbled into a writing position when I was in college and fell in love with it, stuck with it. So I've always written about the intersection of behavioral finance and financial history. That's kind of what I'm really interested in: how people think about money and the history of all the crazy ways in which they've done it. What I've not been interested in is advice on how to manage your money. I'm not going to tell you what stocks to buy or what you should do with your money. I leave that to other people. I'm just interested in what is going on inside of your head. So the big takeaway from The Psychology of Money was how well you do with money is little to do with how smart you are. It's not about what you know. It's just about how you behave. So how you think about greed and fear and risk and those kind of topics. That's what I've always been interested in. And I like doing both these books in a storytelling format. I don't just want to lay out a bunch of data and say, here's the facts, make it sound like an academic lecture. I just like telling neat little stories that I've come across of people who have dealt with risk, uncertainty, triumph, tragedy, and what we can all learn about them. I think that's the core of both of these books.
You know, I know it's rude to ask a farmer how many heads of cattle she or he owns, because that's kind of like how to calculate their income. So with that in mind, I'd love to have you make me jealous and remind me how many copies of Psychology of Money have now been sold since publication.
It just passed 4 million copies worldwide. The little backstory on that too is the first print run of Psychology of Money was 5,000 copies because we earnestly thought that's all it would sell. And if you understand the book industry, getting 5,000 people to pull out their credit card is not easy to do. We would have been thrilled with 5,000 copies, but 3.5 years in, we just passed 4 million.
And how many languages has it been translated into?
58. And if you asked me before that, how many languages exist in the world, I probably would have told you 30. I don't even know what the majority of those languages are, but it's in 58 languages.
I am genuinely delighted for your success. Don't I wish I was your literary agent? Okay, the newest book out is called Same as Ever, a guide to what never changes. In essence, it's a plunge into what you might call timeless truths about people, societies, the world at large. Dr. Covey may have called them principles that govern human behavior, that are timeless, they're present regardless of culture or context or generation. Morgan, on the heels of a phenomenal book, The Psychology of Money, why did you choose to focus your energy here next on Same as Ever?
So as a student of history and financial history, but lots of kinds of history, two things will always stick out when you're reading about history, whether it's a history of 50 years ago or 50,000 years ago. One is the things that are changed, that are different from today, from how we do things. But the other, I think the far more bigger surprise when you're reading history is recognizing all the things that stay the same. And you can be reading about World War II or the Civil War or about the ancient Greeks, and you read about all these stories where you think to yourself, if you change the date on this from 2000 BC or from 1853 to 2023, every word would fit in. How they're thinking about all these topics, risk and greed and fear, it never changes. Never, ever changes. And so I mix that with, as someone who's been writing about finance, my kind of cynicism about how bad we were as an industry at forecasting the next recession or the next bear market. Just nobody has any ability to do that. And then so you can look at that and say, look, we have no ability at all to forecast what's going to change. We don't know when the next recession is going to come. We don't know what stocks to buy. So if you accept that, then let's just focus on what we know is never going to change. And by the way, when you look back at history, there are a million things that have not changed in thousands of years. Let's put all of our emphasis into that, things that we know are going to be part of our future, regardless of which direction we go, rather than pretending that we can predict all the little nuance about what's going to change in the world. I kind of got this idea, a very now well-known Jeff Bezos quote, where he said, people always ask me, what's going to change? And he said, I would submit to you that a far more important question is what is never going to change. And he used the example of Amazon. He said, it's impossible to imagine a future in which Amazon customers do not want low prices, big selection, and fast shipping. Cannot imagine a future where they don't want those three things. And because of that, you can put all of your emphasis into investing in those ideas, knowing that they are going to be as important 20 years from now as they are today, rather than trying to predict what may or may not change in the future.
Morgan, I'm going to ask you, 4 or 5 key insights in this book as I've curated them. Before I do that, the book is replete with great stories. I think there's 23 or so stories throughout the book. The first one is quite haunting, and I resonated with it, not because of the exact circumstance, but like the story I'm going to ask you to share in just a moment, we've all been sort of on a precipice of making a decision that could result in a cataclysmic disaster for us, for others. For some of us, we didn't go too far. For some of us, the serendipity of circumstances played out in our or others' favor, not so much in the favor of those around you. Would you open up this conversation and reshare this story from, I believe it is the first chapter, and talk about what the lesson everyone should tease out of it is? There's a couple lessons, obviously. One obvious, one not so obvious.
Yeah, I wanted this to be the first chapter because I thought it was the most important here, which is just the idea of how much of the world and your life hangs by a thread. And what I mean by that is like things can just be utterly turned upside down and lurch you in a completely new direction, good or bad, based off of a tiny little know-nothing decision that you made. And we spend all of our days trying to think about and like strategize good decisions about, hey, if we do X, then Y is going to happen. And that's good, that's great. But if you look back at all of history, including my life and probably most of your lives, you will see that like you made these brainless, know-nothing decisions that completely and utterly changed everything. So I shared my version of this. I grew up as a competitive ski racer in Lake Tahoe, California. It was all I did in my childhood and my teenage years. I was on the Squaw Valley ski team. We would ski 6 days a week, 10 months a year, all over the world. It was like such a cool childhood. And one day in February of 2001, I was 17 years old, and we were skiing with my 2 best friends who I had grown up with skiing. We had been inseparable since we were children, and we would ski out of bounds, which you're not supposed to do. It's illegal. You duck under the ropes that say do not cross, but that's where all the good skiing is. So we had kind of grown up doing this. And when you ski out of bounds, there's no chairlift at the bottom. So it would spit us out on this backcountry road, and then we would hitchhike back. And we've been doing this for years, even though we were only 17 at the time. We were kind of pros at this kind of thing. So one day in February 2001, the 3 of us do this. We ski down the backside of Squaw Valley, California. And I very, very vividly remember we triggered a small avalanche. And it's like a feeling that you will never forget, because instantly, rather than pushing on the snow to gain traction with your skis, all of a sudden the snow is pushing you. And you go from being in control of your skis to all of a sudden you're on a roller coaster, and it's just going to take you wherever it's going to push you 20 feet this way and pull you 100 feet that way, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's a trippy feeling. But it was a pretty small avalanche. It like came up to our knees, and then it ended. And we got to the bottom, and we were like high-fiving. We were like, like, you see that avalanche? That was so cool. Didn't really think anything of it. We hitchhiked back. And my two friends, Brendan and Brian were their names. They said, let's go do it again. That was so amazing. Let's go do that run again. And for reasons that I do not know, I can't give you a reason why, I said, I don't want to do it again. But I said, hey, how about this? You guys go do it again. And I will, rather than hitchhiking back, I'll drive my truck around the mountain and pick you up so you don't have to hitchhike. We said, great. We went our separate ways. Brendan and Brian went off skiing. I went back to the locker room to take my boots off so I could go drive my truck around. 20 minutes later, I go to pick them up in like the designated pickup spot, and they weren't there. And I didn't really think that much of it. Like, I thought they had already hitchhiked back. I really didn't, it was not that much of a concern to me. But I went back to the locker room where I expected to find them, and they weren't there either. And nobody had really seen them. And thought that was interesting, but we didn't have cell phones back then, so it was normal to be out of touch with people. It didn't really freak you out as much as it would today. So the hours went on, and later that afternoon at about 4 p.m., Brian, one of the guys' mom, she called me at home, and she said, Morgan, Brian didn't show up for work today. Do you know where he is? And I told her the truth. I said, we skied down the backside. I was going to pick them up, but they never arrived, and no one's seen them since. And Brian's mom, who's an expert skier herself, I think she instantly pieced together how big a deal this was. And I remember she just said, oh my God, and hung up the phone. And several hours later, we got the police involved, missing persons report. The police did not take it seriously in the slightest, but we eventually convinced them to get search and rescue involved. And search and rescue got on the mountain at about midnight. This is in the middle of a blizzard, like a torrential blizzard. And they had these giant portable floodlights and a team of search dogs with them. And they went out at midnight looking for Brendan and Brian. And later they said that when they entered the out of bounds area where we were skiing, they said it looked like half the mountain had been torn away from this just absolutely cataclysmic avalanche that had clearly occurred that day, the fresh scars of a massive, massive avalanche. Most people, when they think of avalanches, just think of like the equivalent of a rolling wave. But avalanches can be the equivalent of a tsunami. I mean, they can snap giant oak trees in half like a twig. They could just have so much power and force. And that had been clearly what had happened here. After about 9 hours of searching, so the next morning at about 9 a.m., the search dogs had kind of homed in on a spot in the avalanche field. And rescuers that had these giant probe poles found Brendan and Brian buried under 6 feet of snow. And they were dead, of course. And I always have to say, whenever I tell this story, I think everybody, you, Scott, and everybody listening, has lost somebody in their life. Like it's not a unique story in that sense. It's a tragedy that everyone unfortunately has to go through, their own version of it. But it didn't really occur to me until years later, and when I was really starting to piece this together, of like, why did I not go on that second run with them? And the answer is, I have no idea. I didn't piece together the risk and reward. I didn't make a table of pros and cons. I didn't even think through the risks of it. We're 17. We didn't think about risk. It was the most brainless, mindless decision that I've ever made. And it is without a doubt the most important decision I've ever made in my entire life. Nothing I've ever done, no decision I've ever made comes close to the importance of that. Because if I had not made that brainless decision, I would have been dead. Would have been dead at age 17. And I think a lot of history, your personal history and world history, is exactly that, of just like a decision that you put no thought into. It seemed like the most benign decision, and it utterly transforms everything in your life. And when you come to terms with that, you have a newfound respect for how fragile the world can be and how uncertain the world can be. And this is true. A very quick story about how this can be true at the macro level, not just the personal level. One of the greatest historians, he actually passed away recently, is a guy named David McCullough. And David McCullough was kind of the foremost authority on the Revolutionary War. And he tells a story about the Battle of Long Island during the Revolutionary War, where George Washington and his troops were cornered by the British. And it was almost over. All the British had to do was sail up the East River in New York, and they could have cornered George Washington, and it all would have been over. The British would have won. But it didn't happen. The British could not sail up the East River because the winds were blowing in the wrong direction that night. And so David McCullough was asked, he said, if the winds were blowing north instead of south that evening in the 1700s, would there be a United States of America? He says, no, it never would have happened. The entire existence of this country relied on the direction of the winds in Long Island one night in the 1700s. And you can play this game all day of how we make these very rational decisions in our world, very intentional decisions in our own lives. But if you look back and you're honest about it, the unintentional decisions probably had way more consequences. And that can be a hard thing to come to terms with, but it's just an acknowledgement of how fragile the world can be.
Morgan, so what? What do you want? First of all, your story about your friends is tragic, right? And unspeakable. So what? You want us to do what differently? Be aware of what differently? Put gravity on what? What's the takeaway? Recognizing that sometimes the most inconsequential, innocuous decisions have the most consequential impact that you may or may not have been in control of or conscious of. What do you want people to take away from that insight?
I think in many ways, this first chapter is the thesis of the entire book, which is stop pretending that we can predict the future. Because when you come to terms with how fragile all of history is, we can't. You know you can't, both for your own life and for the country, for the world, for the stock market, for your business, whatever it would be. As you and I are recording this right now, OpenAI, the most important AI company in the world right now, is going through this utter debacle that's as played out in the last 48 hours that nobody in a million years would have predicted 7 days ago. And so even like within any business, the fate of it can be utterly transformed in an instant. And there are so many examples of this, individual and macro, that I think it's a call to arms of saying, like, stop, like, of some humility about your ability to predict what's going to change. And that doesn't have to be fatalistic. You don't have to end there and say nobody knows anything. But this is the thesis of the book. When you acknowledge that we don't know what's going to change, you are forced into the way better philosophy of saying, let's focus on what we know is never going to change.
Morgan, let's run through maybe a half dozen insights from the book. One of them is this concept of expectations influence happiness. Riff on that.
Yeah, I mean, we always talk about price inflation in the economy, prices going up. Way more powerful to people's well-being and happiness is expectations inflation. By which I mean, if across different generations, you know, from baby boomers to millennials, the average income doubles, even adjusted for inflation, but your expectations more than double, you don't feel like you're any better off. And this, I think, is exactly what has happened. You know, if you compare the 1950s to today, the median income, the average American, adjusted for inflation, is earning twice what they were in the 1950s. But by and large, that statistic will shock people, and they don't feel like they're twice as wealthy as their parents or grandparents were, because expectations have more than doubled during that period. And so there is no such thing as an objective level of wealth. There's no such thing of like, once you have X dollars, then everyone feels great, because everything is just relative to your peers. Everything is relative to your neighbors and your coworkers. You just say, how much do I have relative to that person? And that's how you measure your well-being. So in a world where things tend to get better, technology improves, health outcomes improve, productivity, economic growth increases, then it's going to increase for everyone else. And therefore, even if you are becoming better off, if other people are as well, then you don't feel better off. There's this great quote from Montesquieu. He said this 300 years ago. He said, if you only want to be happy, that's actually very easy to achieve. But people want to be happier than other people, and that is much more difficult. And that's what it is. You can imagine this tragedy in which our grandkids, 50 years from now, are earning twice as much money as we are and living way healthier lives. And maybe they're even in a more peaceful world, and they're not any happier for it because their expectations have risen just as much. And so there are all these examples going back across history about how much the economy and society and medical technology have improved with no discernible increase in happiness that's tied to it. And I think it will always be like that. We're just comparative creatures. That's how we measure how we're doing. But there's another quote from Charlie Munger in this chapter where he says, the first rule of happiness is low expectations. You can say that in a financial sense, in a health sense, in a relationship sense, in a career sense, that all happiness is just the gap between your expectations and your circumstances. It's not the absolute level of your circumstances. It's just the gap between the two that's going to deliver all of your happiness. So when you come to terms with that, then it's like, okay, I need to spend as much effort managing my expectations as I do improving my circumstances. Easier said than done. And at the society level, I don't think it can be done, for everybody. So we're never going to live in a world in which everyone can do that. But I think just acknowledging it makes you recognize the game that's being played, about how you individually can have a lot of career success, a lot of financial success, maybe even be very healthy, like checking all the boxes. But if your peer group is also those things, you might not feel any better off for it.
I'm smiling and laughing because one of our producers and I are laughing off camera because he's a very content, calm person. And I always say to him, "Why are you so content?" He says, "Because my expectations are low in life." And he said, "They're exceeded often." Next idea, interesting term, calm plants the seeds of crazy. Talk about that.
So there was this economist back in the 1960s. His name was Hyman Minsky. And he was kind of he was a wild-haired, kind of like an outcast. A lot of people didn't take him very seriously. But in the 1960s, when there was this big burst of scientific optimism, because we had landed on the moon and we had eradicated polio, there was this idea that if scientists put their heads together, they can do anything. People were just way more optimistic about science back then than we are today. And so in the 1960s, a lot of economists came together and they said, it's time to eradicate recessions. We need to figure out monetary policy and fiscal policy so that we live in a world in which there are no more recessions. Hyman Minsky, this outcast, he said, impossible. It will never happen. All you people are crazy. It's never going to happen. And he came up with a theory called the financial instability hypothesis. And it more or less goes like this. He said, if there are no recessions, people will get very optimistic about the economy. When they get optimistic, they go into debt. And when they go into debt, the economy becomes unstable, and you eventually get a recession. So he was like, look, the lack of recessions is what causes a big recession. And therefore, you can never eradicate them. The reason we have recessions to begin with is because people go through a period when they think there's not going to be a next recession. They get too optimistic, and the optimism is what leads to the downfall. And you can apply that to so many things. It's, of course, true in businesses that get fat and happy and lazy, and they have so much success, and the success in itself allows them to fall onto their back foot and become lazy and entitled. It happens all the time. It happens in the stock market, where if people come to believe that the stock market is never going to decline, if you believe that, then the rational thing to do is to put more money in the stock market. And when people do that, valuations go up. And when valuations go up, you're eventually going to have a crash. So the belief that there will not be any crashes is what causes the crash. So that's why calm plants the seeds of crazy. I mean, another very recent, poignant example of this is that we became very good in the Western world at preventing and handling pandemics over the last 100 years. So you go back 100 years ago, there's a new kind of pandemic every couple of years. But then we got very good at eradicating them with different vaccines and different health policy procedures. And because of that, once COVID rolled around in 2020, even the health departments are like, we don't know how to handle this. We've never dealt with it before. And so that was another example of our ability to prevent pandemics is part of what made COVID so bad. It has no muscle memory to handle it. So in almost anything in life, it tends to be cyclical like that, of your success in one area is actually going to plant the seeds of your downfall and vice versa. A lot of those downfalls plant the seeds of the opportunity that's going to fuel the next big run-up.
Another insight is this concept of stress and urgency create innovation. Speak to that.
If you look across history for thousands of years, the biggest innovations, the most important innovations, tend to happen during wars, during big military conflicts. The most, in the last 100 years, more technology came out of World War II, those 6 years in World War II, than probably the following half century combined. I mean, in 6 years, we got effectively radar, nuclear energy, jets, penicillin, microwaves, go on down the list of these life-changing, world-changing technologies that happened in this little 6-year bubble during World War II. And a lot of the reason that occurred is because, look, when the economy is going well and everyone is happy and everyone is well-fed and well-paid, then the incentive for innovation are people saying, oh, if I innovate, if I make a new product, I might make some money. And that'll get people going. But in World War II, it was, if we don't innovate today, Adolf Hitler's going to control the entire world tomorrow. So get your butt in gear. We need to figure this out. That stress-induced innovation created technologies like we've never seen before or since, because people were so panicked about the need to wake up every morning terrified and saying, we have to figure this out today, not tomorrow, today. The other example is the most productive economic decade was the 1930s during the Great Depression. Because every business in America said, if we don't find a way to become more productive, we're going to be out of business tomorrow. And so it was this panic-induced surge to find new business models that were more productive, that because it was necessary to survive the Great Depression. And I think you're probably going to see that with COVID too, whether it's working from home or mRNA vaccines, whatever it would be. I mean, almost every big tragedy, you can look back 20 years later and say, yeah, you know what we got out of that? This amazing technology that would not have existed unless people were so panicked. So there is like a careful what you wish for element to this, of like everyone wants a world that is perfectly calm and happy and peaceful and stress-free. And of course, that would be great. But there is this hidden downside to that, where if we had that world where nothing bad was ever happening, you would remove the biggest influence and fuel of innovation, recognizing that like that's where the biggest innovations come from. It happens during times of panic.
Morgan, you write about a concept that progress is in fact often hard to see. Give us some examples of that.
Well, one of the ideas that sticks out here is that good news tends to happen very slowly and bad news happens very quickly. So think about the bad news across history. It tends to be things like Pearl Harbor and 9/11 and COVID that literally happened in an instant. September 10th, 2001, everything's great. September 11th, the entire world as we know it is turned upside down. Happens literally in an instant. Good news almost never happens like that. Good news is a slow compounding across decades. So use the example, like one of the best news stories to happen in our entire lifetimes in the United States is the massive decline in heart disease mortality, which has saved literally 25 million lives since the 1950s, because we've gotten so much better at, back in the 1950s, if you had a heart attack, you're dead. Even if you make it to the hospital, that's a death sentence. Whereas today, it's actually like if you make it to the ER, there's a good chance you're actually going to walk out of the ER. We've gotten so much better at preventing and treating heart disease. But most people are not even aware of that statistic and know what very little attention has been given to that, because what happened is that heart disease mortality improved about 1.5% per year. But it did that for 80 years. Like if you compound at 1.5% per year for 80 years, the results are extraordinary. But in any given year, it didn't get anybody's attention. You're never going to have a CNN headline that says breaking news, heart disease mortality improves by 1/10 of a percentage point. It doesn't get anybody's attention. But over 80 years, it saved 25 million lives. So if you compare the speed at which bad news comes to the slow progress of good news, it pushes people to become more pessimistic about the world that they live in, because the bad news is capturing everybody's attention and the good news is largely hidden. And so in a way that's very understandable, that I'm sure I fall for as well, people tend to be more pessimistic about the state of the world, just given the speed in which different kind of news events hit them in their life.
Morgan, I'm sure you know who Ryan Holiday is. He's been on our podcast several times. I'm a big fan. Talk about the best keynote mashup ever. Morgan and Ryan, because both of you have something in common, and that is your deep studiers of history and sort of the principles that govern human behavior. You ought to collaborate sometime in a book.
We actually have the same publisher, so that would be an easy thing to do.
It makes a lot of sense. Entrepreneurs, founders, creators, leaders, listen up to this next one. This concept that long-term thinking is smart, but really difficult to operationalize.
Yeah, I mean, I always say, when people say, I'm a long-term thinker, I'm a long-term investor, I'm a long-term businessman, great. That's the right mindset. But I use the analogy of like, that's the equivalent of standing at the base of Mount Everest and pointing to the top and saying, that's where I'm going. It's like, okay, that's a noble goal, but now comes the hard part. You actually have to do it now. So saying that you're a long-term thinker is obviously so much easier than actually doing it. And a lot of that is because if you're an investor or a CEO, it doesn't necessarily matter what your vision is. It's, do you have your employees and your investors and your clients on board with that vision? And a lot of times the answer is no. A lot of times you might say, our business performance is really crummy right now, but we're in it for the long term. Okay, that's what you're saying. Are your investors in it for the long term? Are your employees in it for the long term? Are your customers willing to put up with all your corporate belly flops that you're going through? Very often the answer is no. So the long term is just a collection of short terms, all of which have to be experienced and managed in order to get to the long term. And I think if you look at a lot of successful businesses, even if they are long-term thinkers, they are very keyed into what's happening in the short run. And you can't just say, you can't just poo-poo bad performance and bad culture based off of the idea that I'm in it for the long run. It almost never works like that, particularly if you are in an organization that relies on other people than just yourself, which is the vast majority of businesses. So you see that a lot throughout history of in theory, you would like to be a long-term thinker, but in reality, that means you have to manage every short-term period to actually get there.
Riff on that a little bit more. So I want you to speak to all the leaders, literally millions of them at all different levels and organizations that are digesting this concept right now. Is there anything you would, from your research, from your own learning as an entrepreneur, that you might encourage leaders to approach differently, communicate differently, to calibrate, execute differently?
I mean, here's one story. The greatest investor of all time, of course, is Warren Buffett. He's made more money, more success than anyone else in his field has ever done. I think a very hidden reason that is the case is because he is a very good communicator. And he has gone out of his way to write, not just for his employees and investors, but publicly, publishing his shareholder letters, doing interviews, giving speeches. I don't think he's doing that because he likes the attention. I think this is a very strategic business reason he's doing this, which is if you want your investors and your clients and the people who work for you to actually be as long-term thinking as you are, you need to make sure that they fully understand what you're doing. And that when you communicate your strategies and your philosophy, they nod their head and they say, that makes perfect sense, I'm on board with you. Virtually no other investor in the investing business has the trust that Warren does. And a lot of that is because of the performance he's put up, but a lot of it too is just because he is so clear and articulate about what he's doing and why he's doing it. So anyone who invests with him understands it. And they are willing to give him a pass if he has a bad quarter or a bad year in a way that they would not other investors because they understand exactly what he's doing because he's explained it so clearly. And even if you have no investing background and no business background, if you read Warren Buffett's letter to shareholders, you'll understand every word. It's not complicated. He's explaining these things in very clear terms that anybody can understand. And that is it's so easy to overlook. Like, let's say you're a tech CEO and your skill is building AI apps. You're very technically minded. You're a coder. Something like communication might seem like a soft skill that is just beneath you. Why am I going to waste my time on learning how to articulate better and learning about sentence structure? None of this matters. That's not what I do. It absolutely matters. It does not matter what field you're in. Communication is massively important. And the higher you become at the organization, the more important it becomes. Someone was talking recently that more than a technical powerhouse, what a CEO really is a trust broker. That's really what they're doing. It's like, do the employees and the customers and the investors and the regulators trust this person to make the right decisions? It's not about their technical expertise, it's trust. And so much of what trust is can you communicate effectively? If the answer is yes, you have the key ingredient that you're going to need. Doesn't mean success is guaranteed, but if you cannot do that, it is almost impossible to be successful long-term if you can't explain in plain English what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Morgan, final two concepts, 1 minute each. Permanent versus expiring information.
Well, there's so much, if you read the news, I think a very helpful filter to always ask yourself is, will I care about the story in 1 year or 5 years? And 99% of the time, the answer is no. Not 100% of the time. There are stories where you're like, this is the world changing. I need to pay attention to this. But if you use that filter and you're reading business news and it says the Dow Jones fell 25 points yesterday, are you going to care about that in 5 years? Of course not. So find something that is going to capture your attention. Based on the premise of the book, find something that you know is not going to change about life and put all of your weight in that instead of spending your precious time and attention on things that are just going to expire and have a shelf life of a banana.
Let's land with this last concept in the book that I think is also helpful, not just in our professional lives, but in our personal relationships. Wounds heal, scars last. What do you want us to take from that pithy comment?
Everybody is a reflection of the experiences that they've had in life. And I view the world through the lens of my own experiences. And so do you. So does everybody. And we all want to think that we are viewing the world objectively and thinking independently. And by and large, we are not. We are just reflecting what we've experienced. And the biggest part of your experience is where, when, and to whom you were born to, all of which is completely outside of your control. Nobody should pretend that if I were born in sub-Saharan Africa in the 1600s, that I would have the same beliefs that I do today. Of course not. But we always underestimate what our own experiences, like how those experiences have shifted what we think. One takeaway from this is that very often when you come across two people who are debating about a topic, you think we should do X, I think we should do Y. Most of the time, they're not actually disagreeing with each other. You have people with different life experiences, different risk tolerances, different time horizons, different goals, talking over each other. And when you see somebody who's doing something that you disagree with, rather than wondering why they could be so stupid to do that thing, a better question to ask is, what have you experienced that would cause you to think that? And if I experienced the same thing, would I hold that same belief myself?
Morgan Housel, you are a multi-best-selling author. The Psychology of Money that we featured about a year ago has sold over 4 million copies and counting. Your most recent book is Same as Ever, a guide to what never changes, which means we have to have you back on a year from now. Will you foreshadow what it is I'll be interviewing you about in 12 months?
Yes, I mean, I'm starting to work on another book that's about money. I think it's probably going to be called The Art of Spending Money. Kind of a self-explanatory title. Psychology of Money is a lot about investing, which has always been near and dear to my heart. This next book is more just at the personal finance level about how, why, and what we choose to spend our money on.
We look forward to a three-peat reappearance. Morgan Housel, thanks for joining us today. Look forward to seeing you back.
Thanks so much, Scott.
And we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.